Welcome, welcome, welcome to another episode of the Lords of Consciousness podcast, videocast. I am your host, Clint Culberson, and today I'm really excited to be joined by Derrick Jensen, who is an environmentalist, an author. You're the man behind the Deep Green Resistance. Welcome to the show, Derrick.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to have you because you're a man of great depth, and it would take me probably a year to go over everything that your life's work. You've written many books, and you've been you've been on the ground, where the action is happening, and you've really been behind what's an understanding of the environmental resistance that's been going on against the woes of modern culture. And it's something that me personally, that's something that I'm very passionate about myself, and looking to see where you did a video today for your Deep Green channel, and you talked about just getting to work, find something that you can do and get doing it, even if it's an hour a week or 2 hours a week. Figure out where you can chip in the best. Like, where's your skill set? Like you said, you're not the guy who's going out canvassing neighborhoods. That's not where your strengths lie. But find where you can. If you're an accountant, find an environmental group that could use your help. And maybe you could kind of speak a little bit to that. I know you've already made the video about it today, but how important is it just to take those first preliminary steps of just, one step at a time, maybe an hour a week, going to 2 hours, and expanding that?
Well, it's absolutely crucial to do something. The big distinction is not between those who believe that we need to bring down civilization and those who don't. And the big distinction is not between those who believe that militant resistance may be required and those who don't. Those aren't the distinctions at all. The big distinction is between those who get off their butts and those who don't. And the smartest decision that I ever made, or one of the smartest decisions I ever made in my life, was in my mid-20s. I recognized that this culture is killing everything, and the problems are so big that I didn't know where to start. And so consequently, I didn't do anything. I just sat around complaining, which is something a lot of us do. And so things are really bad. Somebody should do something. And then one day I realized I wasn't paying enough for gas. And what I meant by that is that paying, at the time, 79 cents a gallon or whatever it was not covering the ecological and social costs of gasoline. So I decided that for every dollar I spent on gas, I would give $1 to a local environmental organization, not a national one because they're kind of crap. But local environmental organizations are always starved for money, and they're starved for people helping. They're starved for everything. And I decided I would do that. So if I spent $10 on gas that week, I would give $10 to a local environmental organization. But I didn't have any money. I was a beekeeper, making very, very little money. So I also decided that I could pay myself $5 an hour to do the activism. And this was great because, there's a line from that my mother's grandmother used to say to her, and then my mother has often said to me, which is really good advice, which is inch by inch, life's a cinch. And another way to put all that is that I don't actually write books because it's way too scary to write a 600-page book. I don't know how anybody would do that. Instead, what I do is I write a page, and then tomorrow I write a page, and then the day after that I write a page, and what do you know? A little bit down the road, I've got myself a 600-page book. We understand. Nobody thinks that the first time you pick up a basketball, you're going to play for the NBA All-Star game. They understand that it takes a long time and it takes a lot of work. And it's the same, somebody makes a quilt or anything. We understand that you do it in steps. And so I realized I wasn't paying enough for gas, and I would spend $10 on gas for that week. And so I would pay myself $5 an hour to do activism. And that got my foot in the door, as they say. So I started off by writing letters to the editor. And I was so scared that I wrote the letters to the editor under a fake name. That's how far things have gone. That's how far I progressed. I would write letters to the editor, and then after that I started doing anti-fur demos, anti-circus demos, anti-military demos. And I would just stand by the side of the road. I would show up and they would give me a sign. I wouldn't even know what to say on the sign. And somebody would give me a sign. I'm standing there holding a sign. Like at the circus demos, I was holding a sign, circuses are bad. And some guy came up to me and said, "Why are circuses bad?" And I was like, "I don't know, ask the person next to me." I didn't let my ignorance get in the way. It's like we can come up with a million excuses not to do something. And so I started doing that and did not let my ignorance get in the way, did not let any excuses. I love the line by Florence Nightingale. I attribute my success to the fact that I never gave nor took an excuse. And it was the same with that. Anybody can do 1 hour a week. Anybody can do, I don't care if you're a single parent with 3 children, you can still find 1 hour a week where you can do something good for the planet. And so it started with that. And then I went from there, I started doing timber sale appeals. And then within probably 6 months, I was having so much fun with the activism that I quit keeping track. And that was what really launched me. So I really encourage people to just find the issue that you love. No matter what you love, it's under assault. And find what's important to you. And then we can talk more about this. I don't know what direction you want to go from here, but find what's important to you and start to do it, and find what your gifts are. Find what you really enjoy doing, and the earth needs you. We need people to show up. One more example I want to mention is that there's a pond just right that way, and the frogs aren't as loud as they used to be. And I'm known for saying we need to use any means necessary. And some people think that that's code language for violence, but it's not at all. A great example is that the frogs in the pond are diminishing in number. They're not. 15 years ago, they were so loud at night in the spring that you couldn't have a conversation. And they're much, much quieter now. And I went out and looked, and I saw that there were a lot of the egg sacs were getting all white and fuzzy. And so I called some herpetologists and just said, "So what's the deal?" And they said that the white fuzz is this mold called Saprolegnia. And it's not Saprolegnia's fault. Saprolegnia is everywhere. And Saprolegnia's job in the world is to eat weak egg sacs. That's one of the things it does. It just cleans them up. The problem is that the weakening of the ozone layer allows more UVB through, and that weakens the egg sacs of some species. So what I've started doing is once a week in the winter and spring, I will go get into the pond and collect the egg sacs that I see, and I bring them in and I raise them on the kitchen counter until they hatch. And then as soon as they hatch, I let them back out, because once they hatch, the extra UVB doesn't affect them. It only affects the egg sacs of some species. So my point is, this is something that I learned from my mom, and I was just taught pretty early, that if you see a problem, I'm not going to say instead of complaining about it, fix it, but in addition to complaining about it, because complaining is perfectly fine. In addition to complaining about it, fix it. So these particular frogs I can help to save by getting in. And it's a pain. I hate cold water. I hate cold water with such a passion. And also, I'm not always very smart. It took me probably 4 or 5 years of doing this to realize that I could get waders. And now I don't have to freeze. I would just take my clothes off and get in this damn cold water. It was hell. And then it's like, oh, for $60 I can buy myself a pair of waders, and then it's completely easy.
Technology. Not all technology is bad, right?
So the point is that, no matter where you are, there's got to be some pond who's in trouble. There's got to be a local species who's in trouble. There's got to be something. And if you don't know what's going on, just ask some local people, and I'm sure that they can point you to a way that you can help.
You started this off by talking about, when you were in your 20s, you kind of discovered that the path of, modern civilization was a perilous one and it was headed for a cliff. And part of modern civilization is this predominant practice of, economic system of capitalism. And it's, especially here in America, I live here in Arizona, and I've grown up all throughout the States and stuff. And the capitalism is like, it's like it's a part of who we are as Americans. And it's so well ingrained in us. And we so often think that the inverse of capitalism is communism. And so that we're like left in this like two world situation where it's the only two choices are, capitalism or communism. Can you I know you've written extensively about this topic, but if someone were to ask you, someone just off the street were to say like, convince me why capitalism, I'm looking at, why it's not the right path. And are there alternatives beyond those two options, that we so often think that's it?
Well, if somebody asked me to show that capitalism, I would say, is capitalism the right path for what? The question is, what do you want to accomplish? And if what you want to accomplish is
future prosperity for our planet, that we can live, that generations can be born here.
Well, that's a problem. So capitalism does quite a fine job of figuring out ways to reward the conversion of the living planet into products and into cash. And in fact, that's what GNP is a measure of how quickly the world is being converted from the living to the dead. Because a bunch of fish swimming in the ocean have no value. And you convert those fish to fish sticks and they got value. Same with trees. A bunch of trees standing there in the forest are not actually making you money. And so capitalism is actually quite good at assigning value to things, converting them to resources, and then doing what you do with resources, which is exploiting them. It's actually pretty good at that. Is it good at fostering community? Is it good at supporting the natural world? I mean, I don't take the positions I do because I hate hot showers. I actually like hot showers quite a lot. And I like Beethoven's Ninth. And I like watching baseball games. And I like watching BBC Mysteries. I'm just a regular person that way. But the thing is, I can do simple arithmetic. And I know that if there are 6 billion passenger pigeons, and then there's 5 billion, and then there's 4 billion, and then there's 3 billion, and 2 billion, and 1 billion, and a half a billion, and then a quarter billion, and then a million, and then I know that trend is downward, and eventually there'll be none. And I know that if there are uncountable salmon, and then eventually you can count them, and then eventually there are fewer and fewer, I see where that's headed. And I know that if you have 275 parts per million or 300 parts per million, and then 325, and then 350, and then 400, eventually you're going to get to hell. And so I can one of the most important things that happened in my life was when I was in second grade, they put in a subdivision right next to where I lived. And all the meadowlarks disappeared, and the cottonwood trees and the garter snakes. And I remember thinking, even as a second grader, so I'm 7 years old, I remember thinking, if they keep doing this, the birds will have no place to go. And I remember thinking, also, they can't do this forever or they'll run out of room. And my point is that I didn't have the language for it, but even in second grade, even at 7 years old, I understood that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And so another thing that was very clear to me, and I understood very early on, is that the real world is what's primary. That the humans who come after us, and the non-humans too, certainly, but the humans who come after us are not going to care so much who won the World Series this year, or they're not going to care whether we did a really cool podcast, or whether we wrote really big books. They're not going to care about any of that. What they're going to care about is whether they can breathe the air and drink the water. That's primary, is whether the land can support you. And everything else has to develop from there. And another thing that hit me early on, when I first really became an activist, in the 1980s, in my 20s, one of the things that kept striking me is that the industry would always say, we need to balance the needs of the environment with the needs of the economy. And it struck me, I didn't understand why not everybody saw this. What they're saying is that the economy is in opposition to the needs of the natural world. Then they're saying if you have to balance their needs, that means they're in opposition. And why would you have an economic system that is in opposition to the natural, the world that supports life? And also, what is the end point of an economic system that is in opposition to life? And so it just really, here's another way to put all this, is that people say, isn't there a way we can keep, the things we really like? Let's presume that we like computers. I'm not agreeing that we like computers. Well, we'll just say we do. And all people have to do is follow the production chain back. Where do you get the plastic for the computer? Where do you get the metal for the computer? Where do you get the, what were the effects of this mining? It's like, I want to tell you one more story about this and then I don't know if I've answered your question or not.
You're doing great.
I got interviewed by this guy a few years ago for Nature Online. It was a dreadful interview. And you're doing fine, don't worry.
Thanks, man. You're like, I did this Lords of Consciousness guy. He was dreadful. Anyway.
No. This is great. It's just, you'll see why this is dreadful in a minute. So the guy, well, there was a bunch of other problems too, but one of the things was the guy was a dedicated Marxist who believed that you can have an economic system based completely solely on voluntary exchanges. So nobody gets exploited. Everybody is only doing what they want to do. And there's other problems with this, but the problem I keyed in on, I said, okay, so you do this and do you still have an industrial system? He said, yes, we do. I said, okay, so you have cities, right? And he said, yes. I said, okay, so how do you get around in your cities? He said, we have mass transportation, we have buses. I said, okay, great. What are your buses made of? He said, metal. I said, where do you get the metal? He said, mines. I said, okay, so you do know that mining is one of the first forms of slavery because nobody wants to go down in the mine. It's just dreadful. And he said, well, you just pay them a lot of money. And I said, okay, I'll grant you that. So you pay miners tons, but you also recognize that mines inherently destroy rivers, right? That mines pollute rivers, and that every mine that's near a body of water pollutes rivers. He said yes, he would agree with that. I said, okay, great. What about the people who live next to the mine? I'm sorry, what about the people who live next to the river? He said, well, you pay them to move. I said, what if they won't take your money? What if their ancestors are there and they've lived there for 5,000 years and they don't want to move? They will not move because they will not leave their ancestors. What do you do then? He said, well, you pay them more. I said, no, they're not going to move. They do not want your money. He said, well, in that case, we vote. How many people are there by the river? And I said, what difference does that make? Let's say there's 500. He said, well, the 1 million people in the city vote, and they vote that the 500 people next to the river have to leave. And so they push them out. I said, okay, so you have gone from purely voluntary exchanges to democratic empire and genocide and land theft from indigenous people in less than a minute, all so you can have a bus.
Yeah.
And my point is that, well, there's a different direction I want to go in a second. My point is that if I were to say to somebody on the street, show me that capitalism is not sustainable or is harmful to the planet, I would talk about things like that. But there's another direction too, which is sometimes I don't. And one reason I don't is because I found that a lot of people actually don't care about salmon, believe it or not. A lot of people don't give a shit about the natural world. And so I have found, for example, that if I'm talking to a guy at a computer store, a local computer store in this tiny town, I don't talk to him about salmon because I know he's not going to care. What I talk to him about is how Walmart is driving him out of business and he's probably going to lose his business and ended up getting a job at the prison, which is actually what happened.
Hmm.
And so the point is, you can find places where you can drive wedges. Oh, another example of this. I hate it when I'm doing a talk. I just hate it when, okay, it's fine when teachers require students to come to my talk if they're in like environmental studies classes. That's fine. But it's happened before that just generically teachers have required students to come. And I hate that. And the reason I hate it is because they don't want to be there and they're bored out of their skulls. So I was doing this once at a talk somewhere. I was doing a talk somewhere in the Midwest at a college. And it was very clear that a lot of teachers had required their students to come from classes that had nothing, they'd never heard of me, they don't care. And it was just a drag. I'm trying to talk about the natural world, and they're all sitting there texting, and nobody cares. And I'm not having very much fun either, because it's really fun. Moving back and forth. But this is like, playing folk at a hard rock concert or playing hard rock at a folk, whatever.
Yeah.
It's just not working. So finally, I just bail out, and I say, okay, instead, let's talk about the fact. Another thing, in my early 20s, I started asking, this is what I started saying to him. In my early 20s, I had this habit of asking people if they like their jobs. About 90% would say no. And what does it mean when the vast majority of people spend the vast majority of their waking hours doing things they don't want to do? How is it that we have an economic system? Who's served by this economic system where when you get out of college, you have to get a job you don't like? And all these people who are texting, they got really interested. Because now I'm talking about something they care about, which is the fact that they're not looking forward to spending the next 40 years of their lives doing something they don't want to do from 8 to 5 every day. So the point is that we can approach this from, the environmental perspective. We can also approach this from the, wow, who is being served? Who's in charge when most people are doing things they don't want to do most of the time? That's crazy to have a system where most people are doing what they don't want to do. Why would you have a system like that? When I was in college, I was asking all my fellow students if they enjoyed class and if they enjoyed what they were probably going to be doing for a job. And they were saying, no, I don't enjoy it at all. But when I get out of here, I'm going to buy myself a nice car.
Yeah.
And some of my fellow students, we're like 21 years old. Seriously, a lot of my fellow students were talking about what they were going to do when they retired. It's like, seriously. When they're 21, they're worried about what they're going to do when they're 61, and they're like, just kill the time in between. And of course, what would happen if I did that is the day I retired, I get hit by a bus, Anyway, so the
I'm sure that's happened.
Oh, I'm sure it has.
Yeah.
The point is that we can approach the question of this way of living being problematical from as many directions as there are people's complaints. And so one of the things I'll do is I'll try to find the wedge. Oh, it's like, here's another thing. I was, when I would do a lot of talks, a lot of times I have asked more than 10,000 people over the years, do you believe the government takes better care of corporations or human beings? Nobody ever says human beings. And so that is a question we can ask too. So if I were to actually see somebody on the street and you were to say, I have 2 minutes to convince them capitalism is bad, I probably would start there instead of with salmon.
Gotcha.
And because I literally have never met a person who thinks the government takes better care of human beings than corporations. And so what does that mean when it's taking better care of these fictional entities than it is living, breathing people? And that's a quick way to help people start to understand that the system is pretty nuts.
Do you believe that this 100th monkey theory that maybe you only need a small group of people to, change the way that they do things or think or care about the salmon in order for a larger kind of sweeping effect to affect the larger population?
No, not really. I think what's really important is changing material conditions that I think the whole 100th monkey thing is too simple. And I think that I'm thinking a bunch of things, of course. And one of them is that there's this, I think it was Max Planck, he's some scientist, who said that scientific revolutions don't usually take place because one side convinces the other of the truth of this new idea. Instead, it's because the people who believe the old idea die out. And he's not even talking about politics. He's talking, I think he was talking about the planetary model of atoms versus the more modern version. And it's that they didn't convince each other for the most part. And I think that that's really, in many ways, true. This is another question. Another thing I was thinking when you were saying, you know, what would I do to convince somebody in, you didn't say this, but in 1 minute, you know, if I meet somebody on the street, another part of that answer is you can't. And part of the reason I think that is because this line somebody said one time that made a lot of sense to me, which is it takes 10 years to change your mind. And he himself had noticed that because he was very strongly anti-choice. And then about 10 years later, he realized he was very strongly pro-choice, but he didn't know when he'd made that distinction, you know, when he changed.
Right.
And I know that's true for myself, that if I get presented with a new idea, I'm like, no, that doesn't make any sense. That's a crazy idea. And then about 2 years later, I'm like, I just had this great idea, which of course is what somebody else said to me a couple years before. And so on that level, what I would do with the people on the capitalism question is I would just drop in an idea. I would say something, and then I would just let them go. I wouldn't argue with them because I found, I got to tell you the story. Early on in my activist career, life, whatever you want to call it, I went to a Forest Service meet and greet, and it was pretty funny because, I mean, the whole purpose of this was for them to rationalize their clear cuts, et cetera. And I spent the entire evening, probably 3 hours, arguing with not a Forest Service person, but just another member of the public who came. Spent about 3 hours arguing about whether clear cuts are good or bad. And the stupid thing about this is that the guy, he owned a drive-in movie theater. It's like, he's not a decision maker. So who cares if I actually convince him or if he convinces me? It was a complete waste of time. And I've been to these meet and greets since. I was at one about a few years ago about off-road vehicles. And I went and commented and wrote my comments there that, off-road vehicles are terrible and should never be driven off-roads. And a whole bunch of the off-road vehicle enthusiasts kept trying to come up with me and pick fights. And it's like, that's just sort of the equivalent of, you know, being in a bar and, you know, poking somebody and trying to, it's like, you're not a decision maker. I'm not going to fight with you. I will fight with the decision maker, but who cares? I mean, at the end of the evening, you're going to go get on your off-road vehicle and drive around, and I'm going to. But why don't we just cut to the chase, curse each other now, and leave? I mean, what I'm getting at is that I think to get people to value, it's really hard because the Tolowa, I live on Tolowa Indian land right here, and the Tolowa lived with the salmon for 12,500 years. There are carbon dating of Tolowa humans here for that long. And their attitude toward the salmon was completely different. They didn't perceive salmon as money. They didn't perceive them as something you can sell, and they didn't perceive them as being in the way of hydroelectricity. Instead, they perceived them as their primary source of food, and also as these fellow creatures they had salmon welcoming songs where they would sing to the salmon when the salmon come in. And that is the level of change that needs to take place. And, you know, so many indigenous people have said to me that the most fundamental difference between Western and indigenous ways of being is even the most open-minded Westerners generally perceive listening to the natural world as a metaphor or as just, you know, that another way to put this is that Westerners generally perceive the world as consisting of resources to be exploited as opposed to other beings to enter into a relationship with. And this is manifested even when I type in, you know, I'm writing a book and I'll type in the tree who did this, and my word processing program will try to correct that to the tree that. And so it's even at that level. So for us to, okay, here's what I'm trying to get at, is I don't think it's as simple as saying, okay, we value salmon, because everything about this way of life is aimed at perceiving the natural world as resources. And this culture is killing not just the salmon, but everyone. And so what needs to be, again, so many indigenous people have said to me that the first and most important thing that we have to do is to decolonize our hearts and minds, to recognize that civilization is based on destroying the planet and based on stealing land from indigenous people. And yes, I love hot showers, but I recognize the hot showers required mining, they require an electrical grid, they require all these other things. And so what I really want for people to do is not to simply value salmon. So what I want people to do is get off their butts and do something. I want for people to recognize that the world is profoundly interconnected, and that a wood stove, which is a nice way to heat the house, requires mining. And that doesn't mean that we simply refuse to participate, because if I refuse to participate, it doesn't actually stop the horror. So what we need to do is to stop the system itself that is causing all these. But having said that, that's not everybody's job. It's like, I've got a good friend who runs a battered women's program. We used to run a battered women's program for the state of New York. Now she acts as an advocate for women in the court system. And she's great. Every man she sees, she asks, what will it take for men to stop beating on women? So you get in a taxi with this woman, and Charlotte Watson, and she will say, can you take us to Central Park, please? And by the way, what's it going to take for men to stop beating on women? Do not ever get on a subway with this woman.
She sounds awesome. I want to get a camera on her.
Oh, she's great. She's fabulous. And the point is, I would not expect her to work on salmon issues,
right?
Because she's completely busy with this. And that's the great thing about everything being so messed up, is no matter where you look, there's really great work to be done. So we need podcasts like this, and we need people to file timber sale appeals, and we need people to do what Charlotte Watson's doing. So we need all that. And at the same time, there's this overarching picture that needs to change as well.
Right. Right.
In some sense.
Yeah. We talk about someone who's, some of those kids in that classroom who are going through the factory, in a sense, to be spit out on the other end as dutiful slaves with big screen TVs and nice cars and the whole deal. Do you think, though, to change that mindset, to not even give a shit about salmon, to be singing, to be singing songs for their arrival once a year, to go from that mindset to that mindset, does that require a hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell talks about, and if so, what is the hero's journey? Because it does seem like, in many ways, it's a physical world thing, but in many ways, it's an interpersonal, spiritual story, in a sense, that we're going through.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I agree that it does take that. In fact, that is the essence of the hero journey: is to leave your comfort, to leave what you've known, and to go on that difficult and perilous journey, and then to return to your community with gifts. By the way, I don't
like
know
that.
What?
I never heard that last part. I like that.
Well, interesting thing. I was just going to name drop here. The first thing I ever had published was I interviewed Joseph Campbell.
No way.
Yeah,
Nice.
I was 22 or something, and I was so nervous. Fortunately, it was myself and another writer, and he was great because he knew that I'd set it up. It was all my thing, but I was so nervous that I couldn't even get my first question out. I was 22, I think. I was very young. Anyway, so yes.
I'm 37 and I still get like that with some people, so it's all good.
So yes, we need to go on that hero journey, and I've thought about this a lot, because frankly, a lot of activists are kind of crazy, and so I don't, in my books, I'm very, very private about my romantic relationships, and I don't talk about them in my books much at all. But I want to mention one pattern that I've mentioned before that I thought was really interesting, which is I dated pretty much one woman through most of my 20s, and she was really, really nice. She was a very nice person, and but reading gave her a headache, and she didn't really care about politics, and we basically talked about sports. She's great. She was very, very nice. And then dated a couple other women. Then in my 30s, at one point in my 30s, I started dating some activists and some revolutionaries and some artists. And they were crazy. and I realized too that in my 20s I was kind of crazy, and I was certainly a handful. And this ties to Joseph Campbell, because Joseph Campbell had this line about how for those in whom a local mythology still works, there is a path of meaning set out for you. And so if Catholicism works for you, and if confession and communion and all that gives you a path of meaning, you have a very broad road to go down that's been trod for a couple thousand years. Or if capitalism works for you, if the American dream works for you, if making money actually works for you and gives you meaning, you've got a path laid out for you. But if it doesn't work for you, if Catholicism doesn't work for you, or the American dream doesn't work for you, or civilization doesn't work for you, or whatever, if you're somehow spun out, then you need to go on that hero journey. And it's a very perilous journey. It's a very scary journey, because you're making your own way. You're finding meaning on your own in the universe without having been given the tools by the culture, because it's the tools of the culture aren't working for you. And so this helped me understand some of my own craziness in my 20s especially, and extending beyond that, I must admit. And also some of the craziness of some of the women I dated in my 30s when I was going through that particular period, is I realized that if you're spun out that way, you're going through this life and death struggle to try to find meaning, and it can make you turn kind of strange, and it can make you kind of unpleasant. But I don't think one should stay there. It's great, once one has reached a certain point on that and has actually found the meaning in the universe and in life and in your own life, then I think one can sort of settle down and become not quite so prickly or whatever.
Yeah.
Is this making sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it seems like that's kind of the typical pattern of a human being. When you're young, you have all this passion, you have like your emotions, you wear them on your sleeves, and then you kind of get through that, you get your ass kicked in life, and you get a little more humble, and you start taking on more stuff. And if you're raising children, that's a whole nother process. And then as you get older, you kind of have that, don't give any fucks anymore, and you kind of learn to chill out and take things a little easier, and kind of ask more questions, as opposed to always have the answer kind of things.
Yeah, I like that. And so yes, I think that this whole, let's make explicit reference to the fact that this is very sexist to say hero journey. So having said that, yes, I think one does have to go through a hero/heroine journey.
Yes.
And to find one's own way. And once again, that can be a very painful and scary process, but it's also honestly a process. Oh, here, this helps explain. I had a dream I wrote about this in A Language Older Than Words. It's one of the most important dreams of my life. I was in college and I was very unhappy. And I was recognizing that, if you're really aware of what's going on in this culture, the more aware you are, the less happy you are, because this is just messed up. And so I asked some people close to me, I was talking to people close to me about this, and they were saying things like, well, if that's the case, why do you want to be aware? Just, back away from it. And I didn't know how to respond to this. I'm like 20 years old, 19, 20, 21. And I had this dream that explained it perfectly, which was I was driving in a car and I saw these cranes, not construction materials, but the birds. I saw cranes off to the side, and they would take off and then they would crash, and they would take off and they would crash. And it looked like it hurt. I stopped the car and I said, wow, that looks like it really hurts. Why are you doing this? And they looked at me and they said, we may not fly very well yet, but at least we aren't walking. And for me, that was the dream that helped me move forward through this painful process because I realized what I was doing is I was learning how to fly. And and yes, that's a very painful process. But once you know how to do it, you know, you're.
Do you think? Let me ask you. Do you think, like, with that, you know, using that analogy you just gave, and putting that on the human species in general, do you think that we are building any sort of momentum towards learning to fly? You know, it's like one step at a time. You know, at least we're not just walking. At least we're flying. I mean, is there a momentum that's building towards reversing this? And if so, is it something that could, I mean, maybe it's going back to that 100 monkey idea, but can this, you know, if we put this out over time, over 3 generations, is there some sort of momentum that could eventually take off?
Well, I see everything going the wrong direction.
Yeah.
I see becoming more intimate with machines and less intimate with real life. I see the real world's being destroyed before us. I see people taking, not you, I see people in general would take that metaphor and say, yes, it's really difficult right now, but we have to explore space. We have to push this technotopian ideal that's flying, but that's not what I mean at all. And I am sometimes accused of, gosh, Derek, you're going to be on the wrong side of history on this or that issue. And I think I'm actually on the wrong side of history with every issue. And what I mean by that is that history, there's this great line, I can't remember if it was Eric Fromm or somebody had this great line, when I look at history, I feel extremely pessimistic. When I look at prehistory, I feel optimistic. And what I mean by all of this is that I oppose the technologization of everything, but it's proceeding very quickly. You know, you said you're 37.
Mm-hmm.
So that means you're born in 1980?
79.
79? Okay. So when did you get your first computer?
Oh, 90, 91?
Okay. So you're about the first generation who had a computer by the time you're 10. And also the last generation, until the situation collapses, the last generation for now who didn't have one when you're 6, probably.
Right.
You know, I grew up pre computers. I didn't get my first one until I was 22 or 23 in the early 80s. And my mom grew up in pre-TV. And so the ability to surveil and to propagandize at a distance has, you know, Hitler was really excited about radio because it's a great means for propagandizing people. And it's like, Adolf, man, you got no idea.
Bro, come on, man.
And so in many ways, I see things going generally the wrong direction. And certainly on a physical level, they're going the wrong direction as you know, coral reefs are disappearing, as wildlife has gone down by 50% in the last 40 years. And here's the thing. I mean, I don't know about your generation. I know my generation, I was outside basically from 9 a.m. until dusk during the summer. And I saw a study several years ago that the average child these days spends 8 minutes outside a day. And that's pretty horrifying. And then I'm going to throw out another thing, it's just to depress us even more, which is there was a study that went from, I think, 1980 till 2011, 2012, that by asking people questions like, do you feel sad when your friend is sad? Or if you have a sandwich and your friend doesn't, would you share your sandwich? You know, stuff like that. And what they found is that between 1980 and 2011, college students' empathy had decreased by like 70%. Wow. And the worst decrease came from 2000 to 2011. And I don't think it's any coincidence that this is at the same time as basically the taking over of the internet, taking over everything. And I know for myself, you know, on the days that there has been a storm and the internet is out, I feel so happy and my days are so much longer. But you'll note, by the way, that when the internet comes back on, I go to ESPN.com.
Oh yeah.
So I'm very aware that this is an addiction. But my point is that, no, I don't see the 100th monkey because, I mean, that was a fable and actually didn't really happen. But leaving that aside,
Okay.
I see things generally going the wrong direction. And
Do you think does the wrong direction mean is the wrong direction perilous for all or just perilous for most? I mean, what do you see that when the dust settles, will there be, small bands of humans who are going to bring back the indigenous ways? Or, I mean, what is this? I mean, who the hell knows, right? I mean, I guess I'm asking you to look into your crystal ball, but
my cloudy crystal ball that okay, we cannot predict the future.
True.
And
yeah.
And having said that, we can certainly see trends, which are what I'm saying are very bad.
Right.
I think that, given how this culture is dismantling the real world, every cell in my body wants for us to have the voluntary transformation that you keep asking about and I think about, but I don't see it. What I see is that we're driving a car, and you can either say we're driving a car directly over a cliff or we're driving a car directly into a brick wall. And what I see is the driver putting the foot on the gas pedal.
Yeah, me too.
I don't even see us hitting the brakes. And I see most of us in the car as signing petitions asking the driver to slow down, or praying that the person will slow down, or lighting incense. And I don't see many of us trying to scratch and claw and get our hands on the person's leg and pull their leg off the gas pedal. And so what will be in the future? Okay, here's something that my friend John Osborne always says that I think is really, really important and ties back to people getting off their butts, is because I asked him, he's a longtime environmental activist, he's the one who really got me started. And I say, why do you do the work that you do? And he always says, because we can't predict the future. And what I know is that if grizzly bears are around in 10 years, they may be around in 100, but if they're gone in 10, they're gone forever. And same for bull trout, same for this or that piece of land. So as well as aggressively trying to take down the system that's killing the planet, there's also, a lot of people and a lot of environmentalists I know, and I applaud this idea, take a not on my watch attitude. It's like, the frogs in this pond are not going to die. Well, I'm here.
Nice.
I can't control what happens later, but so there is, some piece of ground that you love or some creature you love. It's like, they are not going down, and I will do whatever it takes. And then so far as the larger attitude, one of the mind shifts I've had that really helps me to see, here's the deal, is as soon as, I said earlier about decolonizing, and I think I hope this has to do with the Lords of Consciousness idea, that one of the things about decolonizing is changing your loyalty away from the system into the natural world. Absolutely. And once you do that, then everything else becomes technical. And one of the ways I think about this a lot is if aliens had come down from outer space and they were vacuuming the oceans and they were changing the climate and they were putting dioxin in every mother's breast milk, and they were also giving us these really cool computer games that we can play, and they were giving us tomatoes in January that taste actually quite terrible and don't actually taste like real tomatoes, but leave that aside. If they were doing all this, we would know what to do. If they were killing the planet, we would respond appropriately. But because it is the government to which we have, all the governments, to which we have pledged allegiance, we suddenly get really stupid. And we'll say things. I got a phone call one time. It's a joke I've been telling for years, but it's true. A friend of mine called me up and said, how much longer do you think we're going to be in Iraq? I said, we're in Iraq? I thought we were. And my friend said, how much longer do you think our troops are going to be in Iraq? I said, I got troops? Holy crap. Will they do what I tell them? If I ask them to take out the Grand Coulee Dam, will they do it? He's like, yeah, this is why I only call you once every 6 weeks. Or here's another example. This is so funny. There's a little while ago, there was something on the news about the United States torturing. And I'm watching the news with my mom, and she says, oh, this is so terrible that we torture. And I looked at her and I said, Mom, you torture? That's terrible. My mom looked at me and she said, I'm 84 years old. I'm your mother. Don't do this to me.
It's a powerful practice, though. I mean, if you really start being conscious of even your language towards what you're associating yourself with, there's no doubt.
I got this from Chomsky, actually. I noticed, actually, somebody pointed out to me that Chomsky does not say, as he's writing his books, he doesn't say our government. He says the U.S. government. And up until then, I was doing the we thing, you know? We do this, we do that. It's like, nope, I'll learn that one from Chomsky.
Do you think that we need to reach a certain amount of number of people, kind of like what we've seen with the Dakota Access Pipeline, in terms of throwing ourselves on the cogs of the big machine? And you know, I know you've talked about this before, but you know, how do we get to that point? I mean, it seems like when there's only a small group of us, yeah, we're all the guys in black suits and SUVs are gonna just come take you away if you try to do shit like that, and then no one will hear from you and no one will care. Or does it take a large group like we saw in Dakotas?
Well, and ultimately, they put in the pipeline. I mean, so that
it's a good point.
Yes, if we had the numbers, we could shut down this party overnight. You know, it's like it cracks me up. France is really good at this. You know, it's like they'll get pissed off at something, and all of a sudden you've got 10,000 people blockading oil ports. And so if we had those numbers, we could just, you know, go stand and let the numbers carry the day. But we don't have those numbers. And so part of what my work is about, and presumably your work as well, is about I'm a recruiter, you know? That part of my work is attempting to recruit more people. And then in addition, if we don't have the numbers, and if what we care about, see, here's the deal. I don't actually care about numbers. I do care about numbers. I care about all sorts of things, but only insofar as they convert into more wild salmon every year and more migratory songbirds. So the question is, how do we get there? And I'm very much a pragmatist on that. I don't care whether we get there because there's a multi-billionaire who suddenly decides to fund the revolution, or whether it's one person figures out how to do it, or whether 10 people, or whether it's all, for me, once you've made your loyalty to the natural world, or in Charlotte Watson's case to women, you know, whatever you've chosen, once you make your loyalty to it, everything else from that point, for me, becomes technical. It's like, how do we get from point A to point B? How do we raise a large army like you're talking about? And by army, it doesn't mean we have to have weapons. We can talk about that. How do you raise that group of people? And how do you do it? Here's another problem, is that this culture and both capitalism and patriarchy are really, really good, and any abusive system is really, really good at co-opting movements to turn them back to support the abusive movement in the first place. And let's pretend for a second that Jesus really existed. And let's pretend for a second that Jesus really did talk about, love everybody, okay? How long did it take before that message was turned into a tool of empire? 150 years, 200 years. This culture is really, really good at that. It can take, okay, I think about this with chattel slavery. Chattel slavery in the United States ended, quote, ended in, with the American Civil War. And what they did in response is to create the Jim Crow laws. And then from the Jim Crow laws, it moved to the prison industrial complex. And so that underlying, it's slippery. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
So we can build up this. Okay. And here's another example that just breaks my heart, is that there are these mass movements to stop global warming. But so if you have 100,000 people marching in Paris or New York City or somewhere, if you ask them, what do you want? What are you trying to do? They say, we're trying to save the planet. But if you ask them for their specific demands are, we want subsidies for the solar industry. That's a huge coup, that a movement to save the planet has been turned into a lobbying arm of a sector of industrial capitalism. You know, the big German miracle, even the German Greens, you know, they like to talk about this German solar miracle, which is, we can talk about that in another interview sometime. But even the German Greens say the biggest success of this was all the subsidies that were given to the Chinese solar industry. It's like, wow, that is extraordinary. So that's my concern, is that, not a concern, but it's like, okay, so we have to build this big movement. At the same time, how do we keep this movement on track and keep it from being turned into a tool of capitalism? And here's another problem that people will say, we think that the best invention ever, not the best, you know, the most important invention of Western society is, I don't know, the wheel or gunpowder, or, you know, choose one of them. It doesn't matter. I think it's all wrong. I follow Lewis Mumford. I think the most important, one of the reasons the dominant culture has been able to take over the planet is because of the top-down bureaucratic military-style organization. That the conversion of human beings into machines to build pyramids, because think about this. So many environmental groups, they fall apart. And why do they fall apart? It's like, I have friends up at the Buffalo Field Campaign who said that when they were forming, Rosalie Little Thunder, I believe her name is, was one of the people who helped form it. And she said, look, we're going to spend about 10% of our time dealing with the buffalo and about 90% of our time dealing with human drama. Yeah. And that happens. And so it's a huge question. So not only do we have to build this movement, but then we also have to figure out how we can cohere and how we can keep from splitting up. I got to tell you the story. I got a friend in West Virginia, and I was just feeling bad because so often all these lefty organizations splinter. And I said, does this happen on the far right too? And he started laughing and said, he's from West Virginia. He said, in his town, there used to be a KKK group that consisted of 3 brothers. And now in his town, there are 3 KKK groups, each one of which consists of one of those brothers.
Oh my gosh.
So it's the same deal. You know, and one more story about this, and this has to do with the Christian thing again. One of my just favorite and least favorite stories ever is, I don't know what year this was, 250 after, 250 current era or 450 or something. There were the Homoousians and the Homoousians. It was 2 groups of Christians who split. And the difference is one of them has an umlaut and the other one doesn't. And I'm not making this up. And the difference in their philosophy was one of them believed that the fires of hell are real fires, and the other one believed that the fires of hell are spiritual and metaphorical fires. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of people killed each other over that conflict. So, as well as building a movement, we have to deal with the fact that humans are fundamentally contentious.
And it seems like there's an evolution taking place nonetheless. It's like there's a lot of history is repeating itself, but then there's some sort of other storyline going on, or where, like you said, it's maybe we go from stopping global warming to just accepting subsidies for some new arm of capitalism in a sense. Granted, it's improving upon a little bit of what we've done before, but in many ways we're not even addressing the core issues, and it would be great if we could skip so many of these steps, but I wonder if in many ways it's just a gigantic cruise ship that we're trying to turn around, and it's like we would love to go all the way, because you do see it, but it's like it has to go in grades or in steps and scales or something.
Yes, I agree. And I'll tell you something that does actually, I've been pretty much a downer here so far today. I'll tell you something that does give me some optimism for a movement building, which is that Germany invaded France in 1940 and was occupying it from basically 40 to 44. And the French resistance movement went very quickly. They were able to develop within 4 years from, at first, this I'm not making this up. The French thought that the elegance of the Parisian women would cause the Germans to think twice about their atrocities, and would just, let's show how elegant we are, and therefore things will change. Obviously, it didn't work. And so they were able to move very quickly. Within 4 years, they were able to build significant resistance movements, albeit they had the help of the Allies. They had external help. But there we have some help too, because the good news is that life wants to live, and that what we have to do is align ourselves with life on the planet. And we don't have to do most of the work. Honestly, if you just protect it, a forest knows how to take care of itself. So, and we just have to protect it and get out of the way. And so I think about this a lot, that we are a resistance movement, and we don't have to do most of the work, just like the French resistance or the Russian resistance or the Polish resistance or the German resistance didn't have to do most of the work. Most of the work was done by the Russian army and by the US and British air forces. And it's the same here, that we don't have to do most of the work. The Oroville Dam, the Feather River wants to be free, and it'll do most of the work. We just have to put ourselves in alignment with the natural world. And salmon are so resilient, and they're not infinitely resilient. They're being driven extinct, but they require so little, and we just have to align ourselves with them, give them that little help, and then the dominant culture cannot win, because you cannot fight life and win. What it can do is kill a lot on its way down. And what we need to do is to protect whomever we can, to make it so that when this culture does fall, there is that much more for the world to use to rebuild from.
Beautiful. Derek, that's a perfect way to end this interview, because it's like the drop the mic moment right there. And I'm right there with you, and I'm optimistic, even though the math doesn't add up. The math would point towards, oh shit, where it's where the Titanic is sinking. But the Titanic very well might be sinking, but there actually might be a way that we can get off the boat and create a new way of doing things. And we'll see what happens. Like you said, we can't tell the future, and we'll watch it unfold. But in the meantime, as Derek said earlier today in his video cast, get off your butt. Get off your butt. Go protect something. Go. Put your energy into something that's creating life, that's fostering life. Be a steward to the land and all living creatures and all living things that are in your reach. And that could even be just right in your own yard. Stop spraying Roundup. Start fostering life right there in your own backyard if that's what you want. If that's where it needs to start.
Absolutely.
But, yeah, and Derek, I really appreciate you joining me. Where can people get a hold of you? What's the best way to check you out? Through Deep Green Resistance, correct?
Well, there's that, and there's also, I've got a website, which is Derrick, DERRICK, JENSEON.org.
Perfect.
Well, thank you so much.
Check his books. Great. Yeah, man. Thank you so much. We'll have to do this again sometime. It'd be awesome.
Like that. That'd be great.
Thank you, brother.